Okay, continuing our discussion of Asian Americans and the world of work. And we just noted that there's higher socioeconomic status, that is, occupation and income compared to the national average. We have 71,709 being the median household income with Asian Americans compared to the national average of 53,046. So, does all this impressive success, however, mean that poverty is nearly invisible among Asian American populations? Now, interestingly enough, even with the median income being above the national average, as we just discussed, one would expect the poverty rates among Asian Americans to be below the national average. However, this is not the case. And indeed, Asian Americans experience poverty at higher rates than what would be expected, even as model minorities, so to speak. And by the way, this became especially true after the 2008 economic crisis. This was the so-called Great Recession that happened in 2008. And it was our worst calamity in economic terms since the Great Depressions of the 1930s. But in any case, you see the Asian American Pacific Islander group, AAPI, as one of the fastest growing poverty groups. And this is despite the fact that within this group of, those Asian Americans in the poverty levels, 60% of them being native born. Okay, not immigrants, but native born in this poverty level. Okay, so here we're obviously addressing the last line here. Is there high levels of poverty among Asian Americans? Now, what explains this? What explains Asian Americans as having the fastest growing poverty rates? Well, for one thing, location and geography matters a lot here. Okay, and it's simply this: most Asian Americans, especially immigrants, they find themselves in the urban areas, in the big city, and indeed, the poor Asians that I just alluded to tend to be found in the most expensive cities in the United States, like New York, Los Angeles, San Francisco. They are less to be found in the rural areas where it's much cheaper. Okay, so the cost of living and homes is much cheaper in, I don't know, Topeka, Kansas compared to San Francisco. So, again, the urban areas, the big cities that has higher housing costs, a higher cost of living, living standards. And in addition to that, the cost of living, there's been historically problems with the fact that Asians tend to settle in the urban areas. For example, and this is similar to other minorities like Latinx, Asian Americans have a history with gentrification. Okay, now what is that? Gentrification. That term is obviously not on the slide here. If you're not familiar with this term, this is spelled Gentrification, gentrification. Okay, gentrification is when low-income neighborhoods in the city, they experience this investment and renewal in that area by outside sources. And the whole idea here is to attract the middle class and even the upper middle class into these neighborhoods. So you have what's called urban renewal. You have you see the rise in businesses and even things like restaurants, bars, and then you're trying to attract a higher income crowd into that. Now, it's obviously the case here. It's pretty self-evident, right? The controversy, with this is that the original residents who are poorer, right, many of them are displaced because they can't afford the increase in living expenses that comes with gentrification. You have higher rent, higher living costs, so they tend to be displaced. They move to other areas that are already poor, that have yet to experience gentrification. And meanwhile, that area that used to be, occupied or inhabited by the poor people, that becomes, more of the middle class, if not upper middle class. So, as with other post 1965 groups, Asians have experienced gentrifications in their neighborhoods. A big example of this is Koreatown in Los Angeles. Also, there's an area in San Francisco called South of Market, Soma, and there used to be a lot of poor Filipinos there. And then Soma became gentrified, and now, they were displaced. And still today, obviously, this happens. More recently in Los Angeles, you had neighborhoods like Echo Park, Highland Park, right, becoming more gentrified. These are more Latinx neighborhoods, but now it's more expensive to live there, right, because it became gentrified. So this figures prominently in the higher rates of poverty among Asian Americans. Now also, sometimes culture matters in high poverty rates. For example, as we talked about earlier in the semester, the Hmong, right, the Hmong people from Laos, excuse me, they're not Laotian, as I mentioned, right? They are from Laos, but they're actually an ethnic minority from Laos. And they were like this hill tribe in Laos during the Vietnam War. They were recruited by the CIA to do some, intelligence like spying and all that stuff. Not to mention military engagement with the communists there in Laos. And as we discussed, they came here with the waves of Indo-Chinese during the 80s and 90s. Now, because they're this rural ethnic tribe, in their traditional culture, it doesn't really emphasize higher education, at least with the first immigration wave. So rather than emphasizing higher education, you see them emphasizing things like family, but also like agriculture. And indeed, still today, the Midwest, where a lot of them settled, like, the Midwestern areas, the Midwestern states, there's still some Hmong involved in farming there in the Midwest, like ginseng farming especially. Here, culture and tradition loom large here as factors that explain lower socioeconomic status, lower income levels, and so forth, because it's just not emphasized. Now, sometimes what happens is with, let's say, second, third generation, things change with assimilation. But still with the Hmong, you see them having lower educational rates, as we discussed. And therefore, correspondingly, you have lower income and professional status. That also applies to Cambodians. There's a good video on this called Pass or Fail in Cambodia Town, which is about the struggles of the students there. But it also discusses how, the Cambodians witnessed genocide. And because of this centrality of trauma, violence, and what they witnessed there, you have trauma becoming intergenerational, that is passing down through the successive generations to the point where it affects their ability to climb up the ladder and achieve the American dream, more so than other Asian American groups coming from, let's say, Korea or from India. Okay, so that, of course, factors prominently here. And that's more of a historical thing rather than cultural, right? But even the culture of the street, so to speak, or the culture of poverty, as we discuss, might be a factor that also weighs heavily, right, in less income levels, less occupational mobility among Cambodians. Certainly not all, of course, but it's some, and it's actually quite significant when it comes to the Cambodians. So now we're going to start analyzing class status. And the first thing we have to look at is what we could call the labor market. And let's also remember that when it came to the 1965 immigration law and others following that, that occupational type was a key category in these immigration laws. That is, especially with the 65 law, eradicated all the race-based categories, and they were replaced with family reunification, but also with, let's say, professional classes, technicians, right? Specialty jobs. So this is the case with the labor market. It's going to affect the labor market, right? Now, with the pre-65 immigration flow, most of the immigrants that were coming here, and again, we're talking about immigrants, okay, whether from Europe or Asia, they're coming here to fulfill the needs of an industrial economy. Okay, we're talking about mostly factory workers, or as we discussed, the intensive industries in the West, like railroad. Now, we also discussed this, that post 1965, with globalization coming on its heels, well, we see a new kind of economy materialize. This is a more globalized economy. And nowadays, once an immigrant arrives, we have to think, what kind of economy do they enter once they arrive in the United States? Well, it's no longer industrial, but now it's a service economy. So, what kind of labor market do they encounter within today's service economy? And you could look at the labor market in two different ways, and it's noted up here. One way is this juxtaposition between the open market or segmented labor market. Okay, the open labor market versus segmented labor market. Now, the open labor market, there's an assumption here, and you can tell by the word open, right? The assumption here is that the labor market is fluid. It's characterized by having no barriers, really. That you see this fluid mobility up or down. It depends on the worker's education, oftentimes, their experience, their job skills, their know-how, right? So you put that person in the labor market and they could move anywhere depending on their own agency. Now, this is opposed to something called the segmented labor market theory. And here, according to these social researchers and economists, they argue that the labor market is much less fluid and much less, well, let's just say it's divided into segments, hence the term segmented. And because it's really divided into segments, and that means, there's barriers, there's structural conditions that leads to little crossover ability between or from one segment to another segment. Okay, so because of this being the inherent, well, actually not inherent, but how it developed, okay, in the labor market, post-industrial, like the service economy. Well, this again leads to segments whereby it's harder for someone to move into one segment to another. In other words, in terms of social class, if you enter as an immigrant into one market, it is actually less fluid. Once you enter that, let's say, lower tier segment, it's actually harder to move above that than is assumed or presupposed by the open market system. Okay, so what's an example of this? Let's talk about gender, for example. Still today, women receive less wages than men, on average, for the same type of work. Okay, so here's where gender enters this segmented labor market theory, right? For women, in this case, it's not as fluid as it is for men. Okay, rather, they tend to be more stuck in this segmented labor market system. And certainly you can see how that applies to immigrants.